There is a version of Johnny Cash that everyone knows. The black clothes, the low voice, the outlaw, the man who played Folsom Prison and made the inmates feel like someone finally understood them, the man who walked the line and fell off it, and climbed back and fell again. The man in black. Johnny Cash spent 40 years building that man, perfecting him, living inside him so completely that sometimes even the people who loved him couldn't tell where Johnny Cash ended and John Carter Cash began. But on a February night in 1976, inside Studio One of NBC Burbank, Johnny Carson asked a single question that made the man in black disappear entirely. What was left was something no camera had ever seen: a boy from Dyess, Arkansas, 11 years old, standing in a field, watching a horizon he would spend the rest of his life trying to reach, not because something was pulling him toward it, but because something behind him, something he could never outrun, was always pushing him away. Carson's producer said afterward he had never seen the studio go that quiet. Not in 30 years. Not for anyone. It wasn't the silence of an audience holding its breath, he said. It was the silence of 300 people realizing they were watching something private. The tape from that night was never broadcast in full. What survived tells you everything you need to know about why Johnny Cash wore black his entire life, and it has nothing to do with the poor, or the hungry, or the prisoner. It has to do with a 12-year-old boy named Jack. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. To understand what happened in that studio, you have to go back to Dyess, Arkansas, a flat, dry town built on government land where cotton farmers lived close enough to the bone that a bad harvest meant no winter coat. Of the Cash family's 5 children, 2 were different from the others. Johnny, called JR because his parents couldn't agree on a name, was the restless one. Jack was the still one. 2 years older, already serious in the way some children are serious, as if they arrived understanding something the rest of us spend decades learning. At 12 years old, Jack Cash talked about becoming a preacher. He meant it. Even Ray Cash, a man who expressed warmth the way Arkansas soil expressed water, rarely and only under pressure, believed Jack was going to be something. On the morning of May 20th, 1944, Jack had plans to work at the school farm, cutting fence posts with a table saw. Johnny wanted him to come fishing instead. Jack said no, he had work to do. Johnny went to the river alone. What you are about to hear is drawn from the details of 2 real lives, their documented struggles, their known histories, their private silences, and imagines the conversation that the evidence of those lives always seemed to be pointing toward. The facts about Johnny Cash are real. The facts about Johnny Carson are real. The meeting between them and what was said lives in the space between what we know and what we can feel must have been true. The table saw caught Jack's clothing and pulled him in. He lived for 7 days. Near the end, he opened his eyes and told his mother he could see heaven, that it was beautiful, that there were rivers there. On May 27th, Jack Cash died. At the funeral, Johnny wore the only dark clothes he owned. He didn't choose black as a statement. He chose it because it was what you wore when someone died. But something closed in him during that service that would not open for a very long time. He watched his father's face across the casket, and what he saw or believed he saw, which amounts to the same thing, was a question Ray Cash never asked aloud, but never stopped asking with his eyes. Why you? Why not him? Ray Cash was not a cruel man, but grief does things to quiet men that cruelty could never manage. He did not blame Johnny openly. He simply looked at him with a weight that Johnny carried every day of his life, the weight of being the one who went to the river, the one who came home. But Dyess, Arkansas was only the beginning of what Cash was running from. Johnny left as soon as he could. The Air Force, Germany, long nights with a guitar he'd taught himself to play. He came home in 1954 and walked into Sun Records in Memphis with nothing but nerve and a voice that sounded like it had already seen everything. Sam Phillips signed him. The record sold. The tours began. And Johnny Cash discovered that fame is very good at one thing. It makes the noise louder. It does not make it stop. By the early 60s, the pills had started. Amphetamines first. A Nashville house he shared with Waylon Jennings was running on the same fuel. Police came more than once. Neither man slowed down. In 1965, crossing the Texas border at El Paso, Customs found pills in his guitar case. They suspected heroin. It turned out to be amphetamines, legal enough at the time to let him walk. Cash stood in that customs office and felt, by his own later account, absolutely nothing. Not fear, not relief, nothing. That numbness, he would say years later, was the most frightening thing about that entire period. At home, his wife Vivian watched the man she'd married become someone she no longer recognized. By 1966, she couldn't adjust anymore. The divorce papers cited what everyone already knew: the addiction, the tours, the other women. June Carter's name was in there. Everyone understood, but the woman named in those divorce papers would turn out to be the only person who could save his life. June Carter came from the Carter family, the first family of country music. She met Cash in 1956 and understood immediately what she was looking at. Not the voice, not the fame, but the boy underneath. By the mid-60s, staying close had become a full-time occupation, traveling on tours, intercepting the worst nights. She was not his wife, she was not his girlfriend. She was the person who had decided, without being asked, that this man was not going to disappear if she could help it. In 1967, Cash got clean. June's terms had been simple: you get clean, I'll say yes. He proposed publicly in February 1968 in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, on stage in front of an audience that had no idea what they were witnessing. She said yes. Their son, John Carter Cash, was born in 1970. June was 41. The doctors had used the word risky. June used the word irrelevant. By 1976, Cash had everything he had ever wanted, which is exactly when the past came back for him. The year 1976 was not the worst year of Johnny Cash's life, but survival is not the same as peace. He had started drinking again, not catastrophically, but quietly, the way water finds a crack in stone. June knew. She always knew. There were nights on the tour bus when the silence between them was its own kind of weather, and both of them understood what the silence was about. Ray Cash was dying. The man who had farmed that Arkansas soil for 50 years was old and sick and diminishing. There had been no direct conversation about Jack, not once in 32 years. The name existed in the Cash family, the way certain debts exist. Everyone knows it's there. No one mentions the number. 3 weeks before the Carson taping, Johnny was sitting with his father in the Arkansas living room. The television was on. Ray was looking at it without watching it. Then, without turning his head, he said something quietly: "I never blamed you, you know, for Jack." Johnny didn't respond immediately. He looked at his father's profile, the same jaw, the same forehead, the same hands, and tried to locate something to say. Nothing came. "I know I looked at you like I did," Ray said. "I know what that cost you. I just missed him. That's all it ever was." Johnny Cash drove back to the hotel and sat in the dark without turning on the lights. In his jacket pocket was the object he had carried since 1944, Jack's Bible. Small, leather-covered, worn so soft it felt like cloth. On the inside cover, in a 12-year-old boy's careful handwriting, "See you on the other side, Jay." He held it in both hands and did not sleep. 3 weeks later, he walked into NBC Burbank, carrying that Bible in his jacket pocket. Carson looked at him from across the stage and saw, immediately, the way Carson always saw things, that this was not a normal night. Cash sat in the green room corner and did not speak. The makeup artist working on him would say later she had developed a reliable instinct for what kind of night a guest was going to have. I asked him how he was doing. He said, "I honestly don't know. Not sad, not troubled, just honest." That's not an answer you hear very often in this building. 10 minutes before airtime, June found him in the hallway. She didn't ask questions. She put her hand on his arm. "Whatever you need to say tonight," she told him, "say it. You don't know what I'm going to say." "No," she said, "but I know you've been not saying it for 30 years. She squeezed his arm once and walked toward the audience entrance. Cash reached into his jacket pocket and felt the small, worn weight of Jack's Bible beneath his fingers. "Mr. Cash, 2 minutes." Johnny Cash straightened his jacket, adjusted the black lapels, took a breath. He walked toward the stage. Johnny Carson walked onto the Tonight Show stage the way he always did. Blue suit, slim tie, that famous half smile. He did his opening monologue. The audience laughed, everything was normal. But before the taping, his assistant had said something quietly. Carson had looked toward the green room, watching Cash without speaking. Then he picked up his note cards and crossed out the first 3 questions. When Cash walked out, the applause was immediate. But his walk was different. He normally moved onto a stage like a man who owned the floor. That night, his steps were measured, deliberate, as if he were negotiating with the ground. When he sat down, Carson noticed the heel of his boot moving, small, rhythmic. Cash's hands were folded in his lap, completely still, but the heel kept moving. The first few minutes went by the script, the new album, tour dates. Cash answered professionally, with the right amount of humor. The audience laughed in the right places, but Carson knew, and Cash knew that Carson knew. In 30 years of The Tonight Show, what happened next had never happened quite like this. When they returned from commercial, Carson set his note cards face down on the desk. His producer's voice came through the earpiece. "Johnny, we have the album segment cued." Carson reached up and removed the earpiece, set it beside the note cards. The studio felt the shift before anyone could name it. Carson leaned back slightly and used the tool he had used 10,000 times: silence, just enough to open a space that needed filling. "Johnny, you've been wearing black your whole career. Every show, every concert, every photograph. I've always wanted to ask, why? The real answer." Cash looked at him. For a moment, something that looked like relief crossed his face, as if the question he had been dreading and the question he had been waiting for turned out to be the same question. He opened his mouth. The answer that had been there for 30 years began to form. For the poor, for the hungry, for the man in prison who never got out. The audience knew it was coming. Carson knew it was coming. "I wear black for the Cash" stopped. Not a pause. A stop. Complete and total. The way an engine stops when something fundamental gives way. 14 seconds. On live television, 14 seconds of silence is a geological event. Producers reach for buttons. Camera operators look at each other. Audience members stop breathing without knowing they've stopped. Carson's producer had his hand on the commercial break switch and could not make himself press it. Carson did not move, did not speak, did not look away. "There was a boy," Cash said. His voice was different, smaller, more careful. "My brother, Jack. He was 12 years old." No one in that studio was prepared for what came next, not even Carson. Cash told it simply. No performance, no theater. The morning of May 20th, 1944. The school farm. The table saw. Going to the river alone. Coming home to a brother who wouldn't come home. He lived 7 days. At the end, he told my mother he could see heaven. Said there were rivers there. A pause. "I've thought about those rivers my whole life." The woman in the third row was crying. She wasn't the only one. Carson's hand moved to his note cards, not to pick them up, just to touch them. Something to hold on to. "At the funeral, I wore the darkest clothes I had. I don't know exactly when it became the thing I always wore, but I know why it stayed." He looked down at his hands. "Because I went to the river." He stayed and worked, and I went to the river. "My father never said it was my fault," Cash said. "He never had to." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the camera motors. Carson lowered his hand beneath the desk. What the cameras did not catch was that his fist was clenched against his knee, hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. "3 weeks ago," Cash said, "I went to see my father. He's old now, sick, and he said something he'd never said in 30 years. Cash paused. He said, "I never blamed you for Jack. I just missed him." The silence that followed was different from the first. This was the silence of 300 people simultaneously understanding something about their own lives. "How long have you been carrying that?" Carson asked. "Since I was 11 years old." Carson nodded once. Then he stood up from behind his desk. He walked around it, something his producer would confirm had not happened in 4,531 episodes, and sat down in the guest chair beside Cash. "I had a brother too," Carson said quietly. "Dick. After I became this, whatever this is, we became strangers. I told myself it was the schedule, the distance." A pause. "I told myself that for about 20 years. Cash looked at him. "It wasn't the schedule," Carson said. The camera operator on camera 2 would say later that he'd watched 2 famous men become, in the space of 90 seconds, just 2 men, one of the most extraordinary things he'd witnessed in a career built on witnessing things. "The black," Carson said after a moment. "Do you think you'll ever stop wearing it?" Cash reached into his jacket pocket and placed the Bible on his knee. Small, worn, the leather gone soft as cloth, and rested his hand on top of it. "When I figure out how to put it down," he said, "I'll let you know." Carson looked at the Bible, at Cash's hand resting on it, at Cash, and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. For decades, when journalists asked about the black, Cash gave the same answer. He'd written it into a song in 1971, "The Man in Black." A careful explanation. He wore it for the poor, for the prisoner, for those the world had forgotten. It was a true answer in its way. But it was not the first answer. People close to Cash confirmed what the family had always known. The Black had started at a funeral in Dyess, Arkansas, in the spring of 1944. A 12-year-old boy in his only dark clothes, standing across a casket from a father whose grief had nowhere to go. The song came 17 years later. The clothes never changed, and inside the jacket the whole time, Jack's Bible. "See you on the other side, Jay." 4 words in a child's handwriting, worn to near invisibility by decades of handling. Cash had shown it to almost no one. June had seen it. John Carter would learn about it only years later, after his father was gone. When the camera stopped rolling, Carson walked Cash back to the green room himself. The door closed. None of the staff intruded. The post-taping green room was normally a managed environment, publicists and assistants, and the machinery of television reasserting itself. That night, the door stayed closed for 20 minutes. What was said inside, neither man ever repeated publicly. What Carson's assistant observed was that when Cash finally emerged, he was carrying Jack's Bible in his hand rather than his pocket. Not hidden, just held. June was waiting in the corridor. She looked at his face, then at the Bible, then back at his face. She didn't ask any questions. She took his hand and they walked toward the exit, and the Tonight Show corridor, normally the loudest hallway in Burbank, was quiet enough that their footsteps were the only sound. Ray Cash died later that year. Johnny stood at the graveside in Arkansas and said very little. He stood with his hand in his jacket pocket, and anyone who knew him understood what his hand was resting on. The episode was never broadcast in full. A shorter version aired. The album, the tour, the prison concerts, but the second half of the conversation stayed in Carson's archive. He made no formal arrangement. He simply never submitted it for broadcast. The people who had been in that studio understood without being told that some things are not television. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Cash's music that musicians close to him noticed, but struggled to articulate. Not technical. It was the quality of space he left inside a song. The pauses that now felt inhabited rather than empty, as if something clenched for 30 years had loosened, just slightly, just enough. After that period, John Carter Cash would say years later, "My father sang like a man who had finally decided to stop running. Not that he'd arrived anywhere, just that he'd stopped running." NBC received over 18,000 letters following the partial broadcast, more than any Tonight Show episode that year. Many were addressed not to the show, but simply to Johnny Cash. NBC Burbank. Grief counselors reported a measurable increase in calls from men in their 40s and 50s. Several veterans organizations wrote to thank Cash for reasons they found difficult to fully explain. June Carter Cash died on May 15, 2003. She had been the one who told him to say it. 30 years before, she had stood in the corridor and held his hand when it was done. Cash followed her 4 months later on September 12, 2003. The official cause was complications from diabetes. The people who loved him used different language. Among his personal effects, on the nightstand beside his bed, was a small worn Bible. The leather had gone completely soft. On the inside cover, in handwriting faded to near invisibility over 60 years, 4 words remained legible. "See you on the other side, Jay." Whether Carson ever saw that Bible again after the green room, no one knows. But in Carson's private archive, filed under a date in February 1976, a single index card was found after his death in 2005. On it, in Carson's handwriting, 3 words. He put it down. If this story moved you, take a second right now to subscribe. It's free, and it means we can keep telling the ones that deserve to be told. Drop a comment below, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and tell me this. Is there something you've been carrying since you were 11 years old? Something that changed the clothes you wear, the songs you sing, the silence you keep? Because somewhere tonight, someone is sitting in a green room, holding the thing they've never put down, and all they need is for someone to ask the right question.